Hello, and welcome to today's presentation on standard EC.02.03.05. The hospital maintains fire safety equipment and fire safety building features. Although today's training is tailored for folks accredited by the Joint Commission, this really applies to any hospital that abides by the CMS rules, which is the 2012 edition of the Life Safety Code. Before we get started, I did want to share with you a program that I have that's tailored for the field technicians. This program is called the Certified Healthcare Life Safety Technician 1, and the content outline is there on the right. This will train your folks on how to maintain your passive fire protection features of your building. That is your fire doors, your fire and smoke barriers, your exit signs, and how to inspect means of egress. The benefits of this program, well, it'll boost your staff morale by providing the training resources they need to succeed. It'll demonstrate that your staff in the field are competent to your AHJs and accreditation organizations. And ultimately, it'll provide peace of mind. It'll ensure that you have a safe physical environment for staff, visitors, and patients. So the purpose of today's training is to standardize the process for inspection and testing frequency requirements for the fire protection systems throughout the organization. Fire protection systems will be inspected per but not limited to the 2018 Hospital Accreditation Standards, NFPA 10 2010 edition, NFPA 25 2011 edition, NFPA 72 2010 edition, NFPA 80 2010 edition, NFPA 101 2012 edition, and NFPA 105 2010 edition as required by the authority having jurisdiction and the Joint Commission. Today's references, as we just spoke about, are displayed here. You see the 2018 HAS book, Life Safety Code, National Fire Alarms and Signaling Code Standard, NFPA 10, which is for portable fire extinguishers, NFPA 25, which is for water-based fire protection systems, i.e. your sprinkler systems, NFPA 80, which is for fire doors. Now, you see the year editions are specific, and that's important, and we'll get into that as we move along, because you do have to abide by those specific year editions of those standards. Now, getting started, EP1. At least quarterly, the hospital tests supervisory signal devices except valve tamper switches. The results and completion dates are documented. So in your sprinkler system, or let's take it back, in a fire alarm system, you produce three signals: your trouble signal, supervisory, and your fire alarm. Your fire alarm signal is just that. It's going to let you know that there's a sign of a fire or a device has activated because a fire has either been detected or someone has visually seen the fire. A supervisory device is a device that monitors components and doesn't necessitate the fire department to come out, but rather it needs immediate action. So it's supervised. And then you have your trouble signal. Your trouble signal just tells you that there's a malfunction on the fire alarm system. So these supervisory devices have to be checked quarterly. They have to be inspected and tested. The caveat here is it says except valve tamper switches. Why does it say except valve tamper switches? Because tamper switches also produce a supervisory signal. So this can be confusing as it tells you that supervisory devices have to be tested quarterly, but then it says, wait a minute, except valve tamper switches. So valve tamper switches are the exception to this EP1 rule. Now your supervisory devices are going to be your fire pump running, AC fail, phase reversal. This is specific to your fire pump. And your dry pipe systems are going to have low air and high air supervisory alarms. You could have low and high level water alarms on your tank. And you could also have room temperature monitor as a supervisory signal. These devices would have to be tested quarterly. Now going on to EP2, every 6 months, so this is a semi-annual, the hospital tests vane type and pressure type water flow devices and valve tamper switches. So there's your valve tamper switches that do produce a supervisory signal, but those specific supervisory signals can be tested on a semi-annual basis in lieu of quarterly. Now it also says that your vane type and pressure type water flow devices have to be tested semi-annually. Oftentimes, your sprinkler contractors out here on a quarterly basis, and they simply do all the devices that have to do with the sprinkler system on a quarterly basis. But you can have them test these two specific items on a semi-annual basis. And the bulk of your sprinkler components and devices are going to be your control valves, your tamper switches, and your water flow switches. So keep that in mind if you're trying to reduce cost. The minimum standard says every 6 months you shall test tamper control valves and vane type water flow switches. Now, your control valve is your water source shutoff for your sprinkler system. It's important that they're supervised because if someone's doing any work or someone maliciously shuts it off, you won't have any water to put out the fire or suppress the fire. Your water flow switch is going to let you know that a water is flowing through a sprinkler system. That is, either the sprinkler head is activated or there's been an accidental discharge. So your water flow switch is important. It lets you know there's a general water flow for that area or zone that it covers. Typically, depending on how big your floor is, you usually have one water flow switch per floor. Now, if the floor square footage is pretty large, you're going to have multiple flow switches with multiple zones. So when you get a water flow switch, a typical alarm would be a water flow alarm, third floor, stair A. Now, that's not the origin of the actual water flow or sprinkler that's been activated. That's just simply where the riser resides. That is where the control valve and the water flow switch reside. So if you're responding to this specific alarm, you want to scour the entire floor or zone that it serves, as you don't know the specific origin of the water flowing. You want to look for signs of water flowing and or signs of fire, because if a sprinkler head activates on the third floor, it doesn't tell you the specific area that it's activated. You still have to walk the entire floor or zone that it serves to verify where water is flowing. EP3, every 12 months, the hospital tests duct detectors, heat detectors, manual fire alarm boxes, and smoke detectors. The results and completion dates are documented. Now, this is basically the bulk of your fire alarm system. Your duct detectors, your heat detectors, pull stations, and smoke detectors. Your duct detectors, it's basically a smoke detector in a plastic housing that has metal tubing or conduit that's perforated. That is, it has holes in it, and it's penetrating the ductwork, and it's sampling the air movement of that ductwork. And the purpose of this, in theory, the smoke would go in through the perforated holes into the enclosure of the duct detector housing and smoke out the smoke detector, which then would produce a fire alarm signal. Purpose of this is to prevent migration of smoke and to prevent fresh oxygen to a fire. Now, sometimes these duct detectors that you have, they are allowed to produce a supervisory signal. If that's the case, they're still held to an annual standard of testing. So once a year, you have to test these duct detectors. There's another EP separately that defines what these duct detectors have to do and what you have to check for. But at a minimum, you have to check all your duct detectors once a year. Now, your heat detector, those also have to be checked annually. Your heat detector is somewhat like a sprinkler head, because a sprinkler head is, to me, like a heat detector. It detects heat. The difference is a sprinkler head will also let water out, which then in turn attempts to suppress the fire. Your pull station is just a manual means to activate the fire alarm system. That is, that someone has identified signs of a fire and they want to go and pull the pull station. So you see the term manual fire alarm box. That's just an old terminology that's used in the code and standard that basically is a pull station. So a fire alarm box is a pull station. And then you have your smoke detector. Your smoke detector is your early warning device. Smoke detectors are very important because they tell you when the fire is in its incipient stage. That is when it's just fresh and beginning. So it's going to give you time to evacuate, and it's going to notify folks when the fire alarm system goes off. Conversely, a heat detector, it only activates when the flame or heat has reached a predetermined temperature. So a heat detector versus smoke detector is day and night, where a smoke detector is going to let you know as it detects smoke. A heat detector is going to let you know when the fire's kind of gone out of hand already. I mean, it's a full-blown flame to activate that heat source, or that temperature rather. EP4, every 12 months, the hospital tests visual and audible fire alarms, including speakers and door releasing devices on the inventory. The results and completion dates are documented. So this is your fire alarm speaker strobes, your speaker only, your strobe only. You need to verify these once a year. Verify they have correct audible, verify the strobes are flashing. And then you need to verify your fire door release here's a picture via hold open device. So you have your standard fire doors or smoke doors that are held open for convenience in the corridor, cross corridors, and they're released upon a general fire alarm or by the respective smoke detector in that vicinity of that fire door or smoke door opening. Now, these have to be checked annually as well. And also, automatic fire doors have to be checked. There's another slide that talks about that. So, any device that has to do with its interface with the fire alarm really has to be checked annually. So, any relay device, any function that's integrated to your fire alarm would have to be tested on an annual basis. EP5, every 12 months, the hospital tests fire alarm equipment for notifying off-site fire responders. The results and completion dates are documented. Now, you've seen the common theme, the results and completion dates are documented. Everything has to be documented, and we'll get into that on another slide as well. Just wanted to point that out. So this was a change recently when the code adoption occurred on July 5th, 2016. In previous years, this test had to be performed quarterly. And so what they do is there's a picture of an external fire alarm communicator, or sometimes we reference this as a dialer. Most of the time, this dialer is integrated within the panel, or it's just tucked in behind the control panel. You never really even see it. But it will have phone lines connected to it, two phone lines, a primary line and a backup line. Oftentimes you see a voice over IP phone line or a radio cellular data phone line. The purpose of this is to verify that the monitoring station is receiving the proper signals in a timely manner. So they'll test fire alarm signal, supervisory signal, and a trouble signal. And that signal has to be received by the monitoring station and dispatched to the local fire department within 90 seconds. So when they're testing this needs to be documented appropriately. You need to have at least one trouble, one fire alarm, or one supervisory signal displayed with the time that it took to get that signal to the appropriate fire department. And also part of this testing method is to test both phone lines for integrity or both means of transmission, as you might not necessarily have two phone lines. You could have a primary phone line and then a cellular radio as a backup, or you could have voice over IP phone line as a backup. Either way, those phone lines or means of transmission have to be checked and tested for integrity, and you have to get the 90-second timer on your three respective signals. That is your fire alarm, trouble, and supervisory. EP6, for sprinkler systems, the hospital tests electric motor driven fire pumps monthly under no flow conditions. So this was a big change. As you all recall, this test has always been weekly for electric motor driven fire pumps. Now for diesel engine fire pumps, it is still a weekly test, and that you have to run it for 30 minutes. But for the majority of folks that have electric motor driven fire pumps, this test can now be performed monthly in lieu of weekly. And it's still a 10-minute test. So this is the no flow test. This is a big change because you go from 52 tests a year to 12 tests a year. EP7, for sprinkler systems, every 6 months, the hospital tests water storage tank high and low water level alarms. The results and completion dates are documented. So this is a semi-annual test. Now there is a catch to this EP. If your high and low water level alarms are tied into your actual fire alarm system, that means they're going to produce a supervisory signal. So that means they actually have to be tested quarterly. Oftentimes, most of the time, they're not tied into the fire alarm system. And I'm not sure why that is, but they're a separate auxiliary monitoring source. So if that's the case, like which is typical, then it's every 6 months. It's a semi-annual test. But please note, like I said, if they're integrated into your fire alarm system, and that means they're going to produce a supervisory signal, if we go back to EP1, that means they would have to be tested quarterly. So it kind of contradicts in a way, but if you don't have it tied into your fire alarm system, you're okay with doing the semi-annual test, and that's a storage tank high and low water level alarms. You have to have that documented and inside your documentation, whether it's electronic or binders. EP8, for automatic sprinkler systems, every month during cold weather, the hospital tests water storage tank temperature alarms. The results and completion dates are documented. Now this EP applies for folks that are in the region that are prone to freezing weather. And it also applies for anybody who has a fire water storage tank that's exposed to the elements. If it's not climate controlled, then during the cold month weather, you have to test these water storage tank temperature alarms. So if these water storage tanks temperature alarms are going to produce a supervisor signal, they're going to be tested every quarter anyways, but specifically during cold weather, they have to be documented to be tested monthly, once a month. So keep that in mind. I am based out of Houston, Texas, and we don't have this issue because we seldom, if any, have weather that's exposed to being freezing weather, that is. So this is not an issue for folks in the South for the most part. But if your storage tank is exposed to the elements, you do have to keep this in mind and test this during months of cold weather. EP9 for sprinkler systems, every 12 months, that is once a year, the hospital tests main drains at system low point or at all system risers. The results and completion dates are documented. So the main drain test, the purpose of this test is to basically what they do is they drain out the water, out the riser, and they simply fill it back up. The purpose is to verify if you have adequate water flow source or supply pressure. So if you just think about it, if you were to drain out your system and go back to refill as a routine and it takes longer than usual, or you see some issues when it's starting to fill back up, then that's going to let you know that your water source is compromised. And that's the purpose of a main drain test. Now, I will say as a bonus here, this is every once a year test, but if you have a certain configuration, if you dive deeper into NFPA 25, it'll tell you that if you have your fire sprinkler riser before an actual backflow preventer, which is another device, then this test has to be done quarterly. And that's because backflow preventers, which are just that, they're meant to prevent water from the city or from your system flowing back into the city, are prone to failure. And because of that, the frequency is every 3 months. It's just a quarterly instead of 12 months. So ask your fire sprinkler vendor, ask them, the contractor, ask them if you have a backflow preventer in front of your sprinkler system. Now the next slide is EP10. For sprinkler systems, every quarter, the hospital inspects all fire department water supply connections. The results and completion dates are documented. So this is your FDC fire department connection. This is an auxiliary water source that can be added to your sprinkler system to provide supplemental water, and or let's just say your water source is compromised, whether it's your fire water tank or the city water's been compromised. This would allow the fire trucks to pull up to your building, hook up to your outlets, and pump in water at a temperature that is adequate for your piping system. So these have to be inspected quarterly, and they're checking to make sure that the caps are on. Oftentimes the caps are taken or stolen if they're brass caps. It makes sure that nothing's stuck inside the actual piping system. Birds tend to flock into these systems. So your FDCs have to be checked quarterly. Now, in addition to your FDCs, you also have to check your pressure reducing valves. You might have pressure reducing valves if you have a high-rise system or high-rise building, that is. So make sure your fire sprinkler contractors are also annotating, unless you're doing it in-house, your PRVs to your sprinkler system, your fire sprinkler system. Those also have to be visually inspected quarterly. EP11 for sprinkler systems, every 12 months, the hospital tests fire pumps under flow. The results and completion dates are documented. So we talked about the no flow test, which used to be a weekly requirement, is now can be done monthly. At least once a year, you do a full flow test, and your fire sprinkler contractor will test your fire pump at 100% capacity, and then they'll do another test at 150% capacity. And when they do that at 150%, make sure they're doing that test, the 150% capacity test, under emergency power, that is emergency generator. Make sure that's documented. Surveyors will look for that, and that's low-hanging fruit when they go to look at this specific EP11. EP12, every 5 years, the hospital conducts hydrostatic and water flow tests for standpipe systems. The results and completion dates are documented. So a standpipe, the best way I can compare that or provide an analogy is a standpipe is to a building the way fire hydrant is to a city block. So essentially, these standpipes that you see in the building that you see when you walk through the stairwells occasionally they're basically fire hydrants. They're there for the firefighters to hook up to in case they need to put the fire out that probably hasn't been put out fully by the sprinkler system. Because believe it or not, a fire sprinkler system, they're called fire suppression devices. They're actually not designed to put fires out. Although 99% of the time, they are actually going to put the fire out. They're going to douse the fire out. But they're suppression devices. So just in case the sprinkler head does not put the fire out, firefighters arrive, the fire's been minimized or mitigated through the sprinkler system, they can hook up their hoses to these standpipe systems, which to me are like fire hydrants, and they can get water out of the system and fight the fire and put it completely out. So every 5 years, they have to be tested, hydrostatically tested and water flow tested. So they pump up the pipes to make sure they can pressurize it, to make sure that if they get pressure from either the FDC, which is the auxiliary water source, it can withstand that pressure. And also a water flow test at the most remote connection, and that is to confirm that you still have adequate water flow coming out of those valves if you needed to use it in the case of a fire event. So make sure this is being tested every 5 years. EP13, every 6 months, the hospital inspects any automatic fire extinguishing system in a kitchen. The results and completion dates are documented. So a lot of times we refer to these systems as your Ansel system. And Ansel is just a brand. Technical term is a kitchen hood fire suppression system. But you can activate this system by pulling the pull station, and it's distinctively different than your typical general fire alarm pull station, which is your rectangle or squarish pull station. As you can see, this one here is circular and or round. And what this is going to do is activate your kitchen fire suppression system manually. Now, these systems are automatic and they will activate automatically. There's a fusible link up here that will activate at a predetermined temperature. Now, these fusible links are changed out every 6 months when they come out and do this test. So this is a semi-annual test. Make sure they're testing these every 6 months. It's very important that these are tested because, as you know, in a hospital, we have a lot of fire safety features. We really don't have a lot of fires, but when we do have fires, there's 3 areas that you're going to probably have a fire in if you do have a fire. One of them is the kitchen. If you have a parking garage, that's another source where fires occur or area. And then your mechanical areas. Sometimes you'll have motors burn out, things of that nature. But just think back if you've heard of any fire or if you've experienced any fire throughout your experience in years of either being a facility director, a safety officer, or a facility manager, or just any aspect of facilities healthcare, you'll notice that the fires, there's 3 main areas. It's your kitchens, your mechanical areas, and your parking garages. So it's important that you have these tests, this specific test performed, and it's done properly. In addition to this fire suppression system being activated, your contractor is going to make sure that the fuel source is shut off. That is your gas fuel and electric source. So anything that's powered up to the system shall automatically lose power, and your fuel source, your gas shutoff, should also automatically, because it's integrated into the system, should shut off. So that should be verified. On a monthly basis, these should be inspected. Oftentimes what you'll see is the actual food equipment, it has wheels. So the nozzles where the chemical agent comes out of is specifically pointed at a direction to suppress and put out the fire. If you move your equipment, then the hazard's not being protected appropriately. So be cognizant of that, because sometimes you'll see the equipment will just move. Either they'll shift it, the kitchen folks. So you might be wise to put like a boundary line around your equipment, maybe paint like a boundary line so that equipment stays within those boundary lines so that your hazard is protected appropriately. And the next thing, on a monthly basis, you want to inspect your nozzle caps to make sure those are in place. Oftentimes they're blown out or they're just missing. So verify that. But this is every 6 month test. It's semi-annual. EP14, every 12 months, the hospital tests carbon dioxide and other gaseous automatic fire extinguishing systems. The results and completion dates are documented. In asterisks or in parentheses here, you see every 6 months, and that's because here in my local AHJ, they require every 6 months. So it's actually a good segment to talk about. That is, these EP standards are the minimum requirements per the NFPA 2012 edition or NFPA 101 2012 edition. What you have to keep in mind is your local AHJ, your local fire marshal may be going above and beyond, meaning they're on another standard, a different year edition that may require, for example, weekly testing of fire pumps. In this case here, the city of Houston requires that we test these systems every 6 months. So then we have to do them every 6 months to abide by the most stringent of those requirements, which is every 6 months. So as we're going through the EPs, also check with your local AHJ and or the state, and sometimes even your insurance carrier might have different standards that you have to abide by. It's important that you follow the most stringent of all the AHJs that you have to follow. Sometimes you might just do best practice and do it a certain way based off your policy. So keep that in mind. But these gas systems, carbon dioxide and other clean agent systems, they're expensive to install and expensive to maintain, but they're very important because oftentimes you're going to see these systems in data center rooms, your main data centers. And it's important because these extinguishing systems can put the fire out without damaging your contents. So obviously, if you had a wet sprinkler system in your data center and you had an accidental discharge or you had actual fire, while the fire would be put out or suppressed by the sprinkler system, it's going to damage your components in there, your contents, your equipment, and thus you could lose, potentially millions of dollars of data and or downtime and interrupt your business continuity. So these systems here are very important because they allow you to put the fire out without damaging your equipment or contents. So, like I said, keep this in mind. Make sure you're following the most stringent standards. Find out what your local AHJ is following. A lot of times they're syncing up with the Joint Commission and CMS. Sometimes they're on a newer standard. Sometimes they're still on an older standard. You have to be cognizant and be aware of which standards all your AHJs are abiding by so that you can follow all of them and follow the most stringent. EP15, at least monthly, the hospital inspects portable fire extinguishers. The results and completion dates are documented. So this is your monthly visual inspection of your fire extinguisher. A lot of folks are familiar with this specific inspection. You usually sign off on an inspection record tag. In addition, you might have a spreadsheet that you log, and you might even have an electronic means of recording these inspections. But these are important to do as well. There's certain criteria you have to follow per NFPA 10 that we're under the 2010 edition. And you have to heft it. So see the maintenance tech there is actually carrying it because the gauge itself, although it could be green, and it could be a faulty gauge. So you want to lift it up to make sure it actually feels like a 5-pounder or 10-pounder or 15-pounder. You want to check the nozzles, make sure it's not nicked. You want to check that to make sure the tamper seal is still on the pin. Make sure that hasn't been tampered with. And overall, just check the overall integrity of the fire extinguisher. So this has to be logged monthly. I would say best practice is to do both, is to obviously tag initial the inspection tag and also keep a log that is a spreadsheet of some sort that keeps record of it just in case the tag gets stolen, or not stolen, but it comes off, or someone uses the fire extinguisher and it doesn't get put back in place. Then you kind of lose that data, that record of inspection. So it's probably best to do, obviously, sign off on the tag and keep some kind of formal log sheet of this record of inspection. So monthly, you do the visual fire extinguisher inspection, and EP16 says at least once a year the hospital performs maintenance on portable fire extinguishers. So this is typically performed by a vendor or contractor. So this is a more formal inspection. Basically, they take it and they're going to verify if it needs to have a 6-year maintenance performed or 12-year hydrostatic test performed. This applies for all your ABC fire extinguishers, the red ones that you see that are most commonly throughout your facility. So every 6 years, they do what's called a 6-year maintenance test. And this is based off the born on date of the fire extinguisher or the last record of service or maintenance that's recorded. So in 6 years, they take that extinguisher, they discharge it, they empty out the contents, they do an internal examination of that fire extinguisher, and they basically refill it back up. They put a blue sticker on there, put a service tag on the collar, and let you know that that 6-year maintenance has been performed. Now, 6 years from that date, you get a 12-year hydrostatic test. So every 6 years, it's the 6-year maintenance. Then 6 years from that, it's the 12-year hydrostatic test. Now, in the hydro test, they're basically pressurizing the cylinder. As you already know, as you might be aware, that fire extinguisher is already pressurized. And so what they do with the hydro test is think of a balloon. You blow up a balloon. Eventually, if you blow it too much, it's going to pop. They're pressurizing these cylinders to make sure over the 12-year span of the life of this extinguisher that the cylinder or shell hasn't been compromised. And so you have a 6-year maintenance, a 12-year hydro. Now, the 6-year maintenance test can be performed on site in a van or some shop, if you will. But the 12-year hydrostatic test will have to be taken out of its place, its cabinet or location, and the loaner would have to be in place and taken back and being hydrostatic test. That is, the hydro test has to be performed off site at a facility that's appropriate for those tests. Oftentimes what happens is the vendor or contractor will end up selling you new extinguishers because the cost of this service is comparable to just purchasing a net new fire extinguisher. So that might be something you might want to do in lieu of having this service performed. But keep in mind, you have to have the 6-year maintenance test and then the 12-year hydrostatic test. And then you'll have an annual inspection tag by your vendor. The only difference on this is your Class K fire extinguishers, those silver ones that should be near your kitchen hood systems. And you might have a white one that's a CO2, any CO2 fire extinguishers in your mechanical areas, or the white CO2 that you use for MRI safe areas. Those particular extinguishers have to be hydrostatically tested every 5 years. So keep that in mind. So they don't even get a 6-year maintenance because they're in a 5-year cycle. They're in a different cycle. So your Class K silver fire extinguisher and your CO2, your carbon dioxide fire extinguishers, need to be hydrostatically tested every 5 years. A surveyor who's savvy is going to look at your extinguishers and is going to look for these particular service tags. Now, if it's a new facility, you're just basically having a formal annual inspection is what you're having. They're going to look at it, they're going to tag it, nothing changes. It's not until it incurs the 6-year or 12-year anniversary or a 5-year anniversary for your CO2 and Class K fire extinguishers. Now, another bonus note for your Class K fire extinguishers that are in your kitchens, make sure they have a sign, a placard above it that states for you to activate your kitchen hood system prior to using your fire extinguisher. And this is kind of contradicting from what we're taught in healthcare because we're always taught pass, right? Pull, aim, squeeze, sweep. But in a kitchen fire, they actually want you to activate the kitchen hood suppression system prior to using the Class K fire extinguisher. And you have to have that sign above. It's a red sign above the Class K fire extinguisher. Go look and see if you have those. If you don't, order them and get those in because that is low-hanging fruit. But most importantly, make sure your kitchen folks are trained on that because they're the ones they're kind of the first responders in that scenario. EP17, the hospital conducts hydrostatic tests on standpipe occupant hoses 5 years after installation and every 3 years thereafter. So if you have the standpipes and in the standpipes you have the fire hoses, you have to have those inspected 5 years after the initial installation and then every 3 years thereafter. Basically, they have to roll them out, make sure they're not kinked up. They have to hydrostatically test them, pressurize them, make sure that they're going to be good to go. Oftentimes what you'll see is they don't even exist and the firefighters won't use them. And that's because they don't trust them. They'll bring their own fire hoses. And then conversely, your building maintenance folks, they're not trained to use them. So I kind of hate to say it, but they're in a way useless if you're not training your folks on how to use them. And oftentimes they don't want to for legality reasons. And the firefighters won't use them. Send a letter to your local AHJ and find out if you can remove them. And this way you don't have to maintain them because in all essence, no one's really going to use them in the event of a fire. So why have them? But if you do have them, you do have to have them hydrostatically tested every 5 years and then every 3 years thereafter. Oftentimes, like the extinguishers, you can just purchase new ones because the service to do it is semi-comparable to just instead of in lieu of purchasing or servicing it, you can just purchase new hoses. You don't have to worry about the integrity of them because they're brand new, come from the factory. EP18, the hospital operates fire and smoke dampers 1 year after installation and then at least every 6 years to verify that they fully close. So in parentheses there in asterisk, you see 4 years. Here, the city of Houston requires us to test them every 4 years, regardless of building occupancy. That is, the 6 year rule comes from being a healthcare or hospital occupancy. City of Houston says, nope, we want you to do them every 4 years, which personally I agree with. I know it's a rigorous test as far as getting access to these dampers when they're in certain spaces. You may have to even enter, patient rooms, or you have to have mobile containment because you're in certain critical areas. But if you recall, when these tests occur, almost always you have multiple mechanical failures. And so if you're testing these and you're consistently having failures, to me that tells me either the frequency has to be increased, or they just have to be maintained better because a fire damper in all essence is basically a fire door within the ductwork. They don't call them fire doors, they call them fire dampers. It's basically to provide that passive fire protection, that barrier, that fire or smoke barrier. But these have to be tested every 6 years for healthcare. Most of the time, you're gonna be allowed to do it every 6 years. Now, what you have to be careful with, here's the big catch here. You have to do them 1 year after installation. So if you're a brand new facility, or if your facility is 1 or 2 years old, find out if you did the 1 year after installation. That's where they'll get you at. Even more so if you're a big healthcare institution and you have build outs occurring all the time. That's where you have to be savvy and start keeping track of those build outs and what those dates were if you had fire or smoke dampers installed. So let's say a year ago you had you had an expansion on your ICU and you added 6 dampers. Survey will come in and say, did you have any build outs? And you say, yeah, actually we had the shelf space built out. Did you add any fire dampers? Actually, we did. We added about 6 or 7 of them, from what I recall. He's going to ask you for that 1 year after installation inspection and testing. So you have to be savvy enough to know that you have to keep track of them. That's the challenge. And as you know, in healthcare, there's many challenges, and that's one of them. Is keeping track of all the build outs, updating your life safety drawings, making sure your assets are accurate, and having that good dialogue and communication with your design folks to make sure that the drawings and those assets are being updated in a timely manner. EP19, every 12 months, the hospital tests automatic smoke detection shutdown devices for air handling equipment. The results and completion dates are documented. So EP19, we talked about this earlier in one of the EPs that referenced duct detectors for fire alarm devices. So your fire alarm vendor needs to verify that each air handler's duct detector shuts off its respective air handler. So they need to verify if you have AHU 3-1 and you have multiple duct detectors on that branch downstream of those branches of the ductwork. They need to activate those, and they need to annotate and be specific on your report which air handler was shut down as a result of that duct detector, or it could be multiple air handlers. But that needs to be specified and detailed on your documentation. Purpose of that, like we spoke about earlier, was that your duct detector, your air handler shutdown is to do 2 primary things. A, to prevent smoke migration, and secondly, to prevent fresh oxygen from feeding a fire. So this is very important in a healthcare institution. EP20, every 12 months, the hospital tests sliding and rolling fire doors for proper operation and full closure. The results and completion dates are documented. So here you have rolling fire doors and horizontal sliding fire doors. So your rolling fire doors, your fire shutters, commonly you're going to see those in kitchens, in pharmacies, your frozen lab. What are some other areas? I know I'm missing one area. Your labs. Let's see. one more, but you're going to see them throughout. Your pharmacies and your labs are primarily going to have them. Now, you might have a shutter or a rolling door that's not a fire shutter. It may be for convenience. There's a difference, but they're going to be stamped. You're going to see the fire rating labels. These have to be checked thoroughly per NFPA 80. There's a checklist criteria. Get your overhead door vendor, whoever does these type of doors, to get out and service these and get a formal once a year inspection performed. On the right, you see what's typically you hear folks refer to these as a wand door, and it's called a wand door because it's at one. Some people say one wand, but that's the manufacturer. Similar to the way Ansel fire suppression systems are referred that way. Wand door is just the brand. It's WON wand door, and the technical term is horizontal sliding fire doors. You might have some of these as well. These have to be checked once a year as well. And who does this inspection? Actually, you can call out the wand door manufacturers, and they'll send a representative to do this formal annual inspection and testing. And what they'll check is they'll check the batteries, they'll check a couple other control components that you don't see in the picture, and then they'll verify that the push to exit will actually allow egress. Sometimes if you're in an older institution, you'll have a big rolling fire door. To me, that's dangerous because once it rolls down, it will not allow egress. The benefit of these horizontal sliding fire doors by one door is that you don't even know they're there until they come out, first of all. Secondly, it allows egress by way of this push to exit hardware that's on here. You'll push this hardware, it'll let the door slide halfway open, allow egress. Sometimes it slides all the way, and then it'll seal that barrier back up to prevent smoke and fire migration. So definitely want to make sure you're getting these checked. Now, your fire alarm vendor will check these to make sure they drop out on fire alarm as part of their relay interface testing, but they're not checking the integrity of these doors. They're not letting you know, hey, it didn't close all the way, or hey, there's some other issues. They're not going to check the exit hardware. They're simply checking that the fire alarm interface is doing what it's supposed to, and that is to simply release these devices. So that's not, to me, or I know that doesn't constitute as your formal NFPA 80 inspection, but it is important that they check to make sure that these are dropping out because they are integrated into the fire alarm system. So there's kind of two checks there. EP25, this is a big game changer. Every 12 months, the hospital tests swinging, fire, and smoke door assemblies. The results and completion dates are documented. So a couple years ago, when the adoption of the 2012 edition went into effect, was July 5th, 2016, this came into play where you had to have formal documentation at least once a year where all your sliding fire and smoke doors are inspected and tested once a year. Now, there's some debate about whether smoke doors need to be tested or not, but the fact of the matter is your smoke doors are just as important as your fire doors. And frankly, most of your smoke doors are actual labeled fire rated doors, whether they're 20-minute doors or 45. So just to make it easy, check all your fire and smoke doors. There's some controversy on whether or not the standard says you need to check your smoke doors. What are you going to do? Just check your fire doors and not your smoke doors? At the end of the day, we do this for patient safety, patient, staff, and visitor safety. So keep that in mind when you're trying to deviate from what the intent of the code and standard is. You need to be checking both your fire and smoke doors. Now, to check these, your fire doors, there's a checklist, about 14, 15 items. I do have another training that maybe I'll get to here real soon that I'll show for this, but you do have to have, I also provide training for this. There's a myriad of other folks that train for this. Make sure your folks are getting trained so that they can be deemed competent when checking these fire doors. It's important that these doors are checked properly. There's a slew of fire door companies out there, including myself. Call your local branch. Get these doors inspected. My advice is if you're doing them in-house, that's okay too. Make sure they're competent and trained properly. But at least get them checked by an expert the first go around, because you're going to be surprised of how many failures that you have on your fire doors. Then after that, you can maintain them and get the proper training. And if you choose to do them in-house, then you can choose to if you have those resources. But you definitely want to get these checked from an expert, from a vendor, at least once. And even if you do it in-house, it's good to have an expert come out every so often to validate that they're being checked properly. Fire doors are used very often. so they're prone to abuse, wear, and tear. So you want to make sure these are checked properly. Now, the picture on the left, your manual swinging fire door, to check those, obviously, you're going to pull them off the magnet. Again, your fire alarm vendor will make sure that they drop out. That is, that the door releases from the magnet, because the magnet will demagnetize upon a general fire alarm or an activation of the smoke detector that serves that opening. But they're not checking the integrity of the fire door. It kind of goes back to the rolling and sliding fire doors. They're probably not going to check to make sure the door's latched. They're going to say, hey, the door's dropped out. They're not going to check the clearances. They're not going to check to make sure that the kick plate, the exit hardware, the glazing, which is the glass, the fire door itself, and the frame have labels. That's a separate NFPA 80 check. So it's important that you get these checked thoroughly. Now, the picture on the right is your automatic swinging fire door. Now, your automatic swinging fire door, you want to try to check those in conjunction with your fire alarm vendor, because a couple things have to happen that's different from a manual swinging fire door, and that is the motor, the operator's power, or that is the operator's motor, or sorry, the automatic operator, the power source has to be shut off during a fire. Also, if you have exit hardware, which is referred to as panic hardware or crash bars, those are usually sucked in. If you have maglocks, in healthcare, you have a lot of access control doors, that's a whole other issue. But if the panic hardware or exit hardware in this context has to release upon a fire, so you can't verify if the door is going to latch or not, because that panic hardware is sucked in. So in order to simulate that, if you don't do it so your fire alarm vendor should be checking that. He should be telling you, hey, this door didn't drop out on a fire alarm. That is, I pushed the push button and the doors are still automatic. That's an issue. Or maybe they drop power out, but then the panic hardware, because it has a different power source, it doesn't release. So it's still retracted. It's still sucked in. That's an issue, because your door's not going to latch in the event of a fire. So automatic swinging fire doors take more time to check thoroughly. So you either check them in conjunction with your fire alarm vendor when they're there to do the annual, or you put the system on test and check them yourself that way, or you simulate fire conditions. And the way you do that is you have to pull the cover off the operator and pull the plug off the power source. You don't want to turn the breaker off, because you might turn off other doors that you don't want to necessarily compromise during that test. So you pull the power off the header, off the operator, and then you pull off the end caps of the exit hardware or crash bars, and you pull off those respective power sources. Usually it's a little plug in there. Now you simulated fire conditions. Now, whether or not that actually happens during a fire alarm condition needs to be checked by the fire alarm vendor. That's why it's kind of good to have that integrated testing. And that's where the future of fire protection testing is going. It's integrated testing, because you have different folks with different skill sets that are checking different components, but ultimately, are these components and these life safety features, are they going to work during an actual fire? And that's really what you want to check. But like I said, going back to simulating a fire condition, you pull the power off the header, you pull the power off the crash bars. Now the doors are manual, you let them close, and now they're going to latch, because the exit hardware is not retracted anymore. And oftentimes you'll find out that they don't latch, and that's when they need to latch, is when there's a fire. So it's important that you have these automatic swinging fire doors checked properly. EP27. Elevators with firefighters' emergency operations are tested monthly. The results and completion dates are documented. So this is your fire service testing. It's performed monthly. This has always been into play. It was added into the 2018 EP standards, but it's always been a requirement. And either your elevator vendor's doing this on a monthly basis, or your in-house maintenance staff are doing this. And the purpose of this test is to verify that your phase 1 and phase 2 firefighter operations are working properly. And this is important so that if you have a high-rise building, or any building in particular, it doesn't have to be high-rise, it could be low-rise or standard 3 or 4 story building. This is going to allow firefighters to use those elevators to further either fight the fire and or rescue folks, rescue patients, staff, or visitors. And so this needs to be checked monthly. Phase 1 is to recall the elevators. That is, you insert the key into the fire recall key, you turn it on, and all the elevators that serve that bank. So if you're just doing that bank, only those elevators are going to recall. Recall is to call those elevators down to that designated floor. The elevators are going to come down automatically. They're going to open up, And then you got to step into each car and verify phase two. Phase two is to have independent control of each respective cab. So you go into the car, the elevator car, you put the key into that car, and then you take independent control of it. You move it to the second floor, third floor, check the hold open and the close buttons, make sure those are working properly. That's a monthly check. In addition, you want to check the emergency call button, and you also want to check the local alarm or bell, check the local audible alarm. You want to check those two. When you do the intercom call, though, the emergency call, whoever is on the other side of that call needs to be able to tell you where you're at, which elevator car you're in, whether you're in the service elevator, car number 4. Obviously, they might not be able to tell you right off the bat what floor you're on, but at least they can tell you what car you're in. And so you definitely want to verify that monthly. So now the elevator recall, it is also integrated into the fire alarm system, and that's a separate check that's checked annually. This is just a monthly phase 1, phase 2 firefighters check. Now, inside the elevator cab, there's a fireman's hat. You might have noticed a hat that will light up. Hopefully, you've never seen it lit up, because if that's the case, then that means that car is no longer safe to use. That's the purpose of the fireman's hat. So inside the cab, you have a fireman's hat, and that fireman's hat is for firefighters. If it lights up, it lets firefighters know that the cab, that elevator car specifically, or shaft, is no longer safe to be in, because either A, the elevator machine room has been compromised, there's been smoke detected in there, or a fire, and or in the actual shaft. So if there's fire detected in the shaft or the elevator machine room, which is the source of the elevator controls, that fireman's hat's going to light up. It's integrated into the fire alarm system. That relay will light that up, and it's going to let firefighters know, hey, this elevator cab is no longer safe to use. I need to exit as soon as possible, or else they can be susceptible to an entrapment in that elevator car. So that's just some bonus information there. But the phase 1, phase 2 has to be checked monthly. Like I said, on an annual basis, they're going to check to make sure that these elevators recall automatically via detection of the smoke detector, and also in the machine room smoke detector, the one in the shaft. You have what's called elevator shunt trip. There's a myriad of other safety functions that have to be tested on the fire alarm side, and that test has to be done in conjunction with your elevator vendor. Oftentimes, they have to actually get inside the shaft to test that detector. Otherwise, that detector goes untested. So with that being said, we're getting into our last slide, which is EP28. And EP28, we talked about, there was a common theme that it has to be documented and recorded. So documentation, documentation, documentation. I can't say enough of that. If you didn't document it, it didn't happen. So EP28 states specific criteria that the documentation has to have. So it says documentation of maintenance, testing, and inspection activities for standard EC.02.03.05, EPs 1 through 20 and 25, which says including fire alarm and fire protection system, includes the following. So you have to have this on all your documentation. You have to have the name of the activity. Is it a fire alarm inspection? Is it a fire door inspection? Is it a sprinkler inspection? You have to have the NFPA standard that's referenced. Currently, right now, we're on the 2012 edition of the Life Safety Code, which is going to have substandards that tells you which specific editions to follow. So in this case, it says tested per NFPA 25 standards 2011 edition. Now, usually when it's your sprinkler system, it really should state both. You should say 25 2011 edition and 72 2010 edition, because you're testing the integrity of the sprinkler system, but everything's connected to your fire alarm. So technically, most of the testing, if it's sprinkler, it should always have the sprinkler standard and the fire alarm standard, because you're verifying that signal receipt through your fire alarm. Number 3, it says date of the activity. When was the inspection date or dates? Because oftentimes the inspection is going to start, let's just say January 1st through January 27th, for example. You want to have those dates of the activity. Criteria 4, required frequency of testing. So is this a quarterly test? Now, bigger buildings I've seen where they'll break them into quarters, seasonal quarters, but it's not a quarterly test per se. In other words, let's just say you have 10 floors and you divide it into 4 seasons, and you test the first 2 floors on quarter 1. It's not necessarily a quarter test, because you're checking those 2 floors on an annual basis. So be careful with that as well. Now, if you're doing the full building, then that's an annual test. Either way, they're both annuals, but you just want to be careful how you word it. Because like in this case, it says third quarter. It's just the third quarter is the third seasonal quarter. It just so happens that it's also a quarterly test of supervisory devices. But it could say third quarter annual fire alarm test. It just means that it happened on the third quarter of the calendar. So be careful with those terminologies there. But you want to specify your required frequency of testing. Is this an annual test? Is this a quarterly test? Is this a semi-annual test? Is it a triannual generator test? You want to specify all that. Testing results. That's number 5. So you have to have pass or fail criteria for every item checked. You can't just say it was tested. Okay, it was tested, but did it pass or did it fail? Obviously, if it failed, you have to have corrective action. And if you don't have immediate corrective action, you have to have an ILSM. That's for another training. Number 6, name and contact info. You have to have the name of the building that you're testing. You have to have the contact information of the affiliation of the inspection company, who performed it. What's their contact information? What's their qualifications? And then you have to have, and most importantly, an inventory of devices. Now, circled here is more of a summary of devices, but it's not the itemized inventory. You have to have an itemized inventory. That is, if you have 1,000 smoke detectors, your report better show all 1,000 smoke detectors with the pass or fail criteria, whether they passed or failed. So the inventory of devices is important, because otherwise, how else could you confirm or verify to the surveyor that you've actually tested every single device? And that goes for your fire alarm interfaces, your relays, your kitchen hood system. When that goes off, that sets off a general fire alarm signal that says, hey, your kitchen hood has been activated. They'll look for that specific, go look through your report and try to scour through that and find that specific, alarm point. Everything has to be verified. Everything has to be tested, and it has to be documented, and it has to be detailed. It's really the details that gets most folks. And you have to have corrective action. And if you don't have corrective action, you have to have an ILSM or ALSM, some kind of risk assessment that either A is going to put interim measures to mitigate the risk, or you did the assessment and deemed that no interim measures were necessary. And that's okay too, because a lot of times, a lot of these deficiencies that are found are minute or minor in nature. So they don't warrant any interim measures, but at least you did your due diligence, you did the risk assessment, and you know that, hey, this is an issue, it's a deficiency, but it's minor. And we're proactive, we're going to take care of it, but it doesn't warrant any interim measures. So with that said, guys, that's the end of today's session. It's EC.02.03.05. Like I said, if you have any questions, you can email me. Is the best way to get a hold of me. It's Ruben at RubenGarciaAssociates.com. And like I said, I can provide training for you. Come out and do your fire door surveys, do mock life safety surveys, help you help yourself, and help you become a better compliance organization. So I want to thank y'all for your time today, and hope you have a great day.